Let's talk about more of your writing. This time, it's prose edition. Hey there, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're here. We've got some good stuff in store because we're talking about more of the pieces you've sent in. And we've mostly done poetry up until now, so I thought we'd take a little trip to the world of prose for a change. As always, an enormous thanks to these writers for sending in their work, and to all of you who have sent something in. Of course, it's not possible to present every piece on the show, but even if your writing doesn't make it on, know that I really appreciate the support. It means a lot that you'd share your writing with me and with the rest of us. So if you've got stuff to send it. Also, if you have stuff to send, but just want to work on it one-on-one and not on camera like we're doing today, that's also always an option. Check out the link in the description for more information about getting written feedback from me or booking a video consultation to talk about writing. I've been working with writers over the last few months on some interesting and exciting projects, and I'm only too happy to do more of that. But like I said, we're doing prose today, which by its very nature works differently from poetry. Believe it or not. So a lot of the ground rules still apply, like being respectful towards our submitters and understanding that my thoughts are just the thoughts of a single reader, an experienced reader, but just one reader nonetheless. As much as I'd love to pronounce cosmic writerly truths, I don't really think there are such things. Different readers will respond in different ways because that's just how people work. So my job is to give you information about how readers will likely encounter these pieces, and not to tell you exactly how they should be changed. The goal here is feedback, not fixing. But since prose is prose and not poetry, and is very often much longer than poetry, it's just not really feasible to present these pieces in their entirety. So we'll talk about them overall and then zoom in on some smaller sections to illustrate some other ideas too. Maybe I could think about posting these on the much neglected website with my comments attached at some point, so let me know if you think that would be interesting or useful. In any case though, let's get into it. So here we start with a short one-page story, or maybe a scene in a larger story. I wasn't told otherwise, so I'll assume that it's a self-contained piece. Obviously, if it's meant to be the start of a longer piece, you'll want to take my thoughts with more grains of salt than usual, but we do our best. Anyway, we open on our protagonist swirling iced tea in a glass and looking at the park across the street, which is where we get to see this piece's first great strength, the way it sets a scene. Greenish-yellow grounds were blotched with checkered red-white picnic blankets splayed beneath the sparse shade of silver birches. The blistering breeze carried faint notes of grill smoke rising in tendrils filtered through rustling leaves. Every living thing moved slowly, like the sun had sapped them of their energy, yet there was an unfetteredness to those movements. There's a great lyricism to the narration here. The specific concrete images make my little poet's heart oh so very happy. It all gives us a great sense of place, and later on we get descriptions of the narrator getting ice out of the fridge with the line, "At least one of the office appliances meant to control temperature was functioning," and it's a little gesture that tells us a lot. There's an office in a certain state of disrepair, a hot day, the irritation of the protagonist. Again, we learn a lot about where we are and what's going on, even a sense of conflict or tension between the protagonist and the setting, and all of this comes through in the descriptions and the peek into the protagonist's head that we get in the narration. The brief story concludes with someone stepping out of a sedan and with our hero contemplating getting a driver's license. He thinks about not wanting to for the trouble it would be to get one, and because he'd probably never find a parking spot in the tiny office parking lot. So he thinks about how Simon, presumably a fellow prosecutor, seems to have a permanent spot enforced by fear more than anything else, and he then imagines how Simon would react if he took his spot. It's a short piece, and there's a lot of pleasure to be had in the language and in the characterization of this weary protagonist with some glimmers of mischief. Even just the moment of a gust of cool air preceding ice cubes splashing into his tea makes me glad that I'm reading the piece. Now, because the language here is so deliberate, the moments where it falls flat call attention to themselves especially loudly. In some cases, some of the diction feels particularly artificial, and that sticks out a little more here than we might want. For example, unfetteredness, which we saw earlier. It's morphologically sound, I'm not going to question it as a word, but it's also just a little suffix heavy. What about less obviously constructed words like freedom or fluidity or ease? Of course, they do all mean slightly different things, but they're also a little more organic and a little less intellectual. Or we get something like this sentence: ice melted between his fingers against his skin. I think the idea might be that ice is melting in his hand and then running between fingers and onto his skin as he holds the ice to the back of his neck. But I think we'd get by just fine without the last prepositional phrase. The against his skin part feels pretty well established by the surrounding context. Or at the end, we get the image of a sedan glistening as if drizzled with balsamic glaze. On the one hand, I do like it a lot, what an image, but on the other, it does feel a little out of place in this arid office environment. More or less, this line is the only figurative language, or at least the most overtly figurative language on this entire page. So again, it breaks the linguistic rules the piece seems to have set for itself. So we have two options. Maybe we trim this metaphor or toss in a whole lot more metaphors so it feels more like it belongs. And finally, and probably more importantly, I do find myself craving a little more sense of direction or progression. It is a short piece, so not a whole lot can happen, but the whole scene does feel fairly static. There's a certain pleasure to a nothing in particular is happening approach, but I do think that most readers want to feel a sense that something has changed or progressed from the beginning of a piece to the end. So again, here we have a protagonist looking out the window. He gets some ice, he looks at a car, he thinks about getting a driver's license and trolling his coworker by stealing his spot. These major movements of the piece all feel somewhat disconnected from each other. So we don't really get to see them as part of a coherent arc, at least not as explicitly as we could. So what if, for example, we see the protagonist right from the beginning feeling frustrated about having to walk to the office on such a hot day? That would set us up for the expectation that the central tension of this piece is his transportation woes, which would then make his eventual turn to contemplating getting a driver's license, in spite of the complications, as a small but meaningful development in his character and the story. I remember reading a guide to fiction writing in college where the author wrote, "Only conflict is interesting." And then he said something like, "Let me repeat that. Only conflict is interesting." And there is some tension in this piece. The protagonist does clearly seem bothered by the weather, or bored and frustrated with work, and maybe a little put off by his coworker, but it feels like a conflict without direction. These things bother him, but what are they pushing him to do? Just get some ice? Maybe think about stealing a coworker's parking spot? As presented, they don't quite have the contextual support yet to feel like they're really significant assertions of the character's agency. They're maybe a little more arbitrary than meaningful. So thinking about some more directly motivating tension and some more clearly motivated action could give this piece a stronger sense of direction and a more satisfying arc. Unless, of course, it's just the first page of a longer story, in which case you've done a charming job of setting the scene, and now I just want to see where things go from here. Now, if the file name of this one is anything to go by, this was originally written for an assignment. Now, of course, on the show, we love writing assignments almost as much as the people who give them. But we don't have an assignment prompt to guide our discussion today, and frankly, assignments are only so interesting by themselves. So we could imagine this as responding to an assignment asking students to note some commonalities across English poets from the 14th to 17th centuries. But of course, I would pick a small fight with the teacher who thinks we're covering about 400 years of poetry in 2.5 pages. That does feel a little unrealistic to me. But anyway, if that is the goal, then this essay gives us some interesting insights by examining the work of Philip Sidney, Walter Raleigh, and John Donne. As far as an assignment goes, it's doing a reasonable job of comparing 3 English poets and finding shared qualities and differences in their work. All of them, the paper argues, are engaged in persuasion. But Sidney's poetry is characterized by a focus on and desire for love in relation to the divine. Raleigh's work focuses on the gloriousness of the journey to God, and the metaphysician John Donne finds expressions of faith in tangible things. These are interesting ideas in an interesting and ambitious project, but like I mentioned, I'm less interested in talking about this piece as a response to an assignment. So instead, let's think about what could happen if we were thinking of this piece as the seed for a more developed independent project, whether that's a scholarly paper or something more literary. First things first, I just have to mention that I find it endlessly amusing that this essay on English poets from the 14th to 17th centuries begins with an epigraph from Robert Frost. Because why not start a paper about historical English poets with a quote from a modern American one? Depending on the context, some readers might think it's out of place, And I'd argue that those readers need to lighten up. But more seriously, this essay leads with a prose style that's fairly dense, maybe even resistant. Take, for example, these first few sentences. Faith, theology, and poetry have been intertwined for ages, and even the discipline of philosophy has not escaped the realm of this one absolute blend, persuasion. Going back to the Platonic hatred for poetry, it surmises the validity of claims around the ill-intended effects of the art form. Poetry, in my not-so-humble opinion, at times goes beyond reason. Not at all novel to say, it encroaches upon the grounds of absurdity, and in that very absurdity one creates meaning for oneself. That is where the pursuit of meaning is coming from, perhaps? The object of the endeavor is surely novel, albeit not the idea of its direction and intention. That is why it becomes arduously awkward to assess a piece of poetry, for me at least. So here we have a style that favors complex syntax and liberal abstraction. The impression that I get then is that we get close to the intended meaning, but maybe not quite there, and parsing that meaning out is more challenging than it needs to be. Let's just zoom in on these two sentences to really see what's going on. So we're going back to the Platonic hatred for poetry, and I'm assuming we mean Plato's hatred of poetry, and not the ideal form of hating poetry. But then we run into it, and like all pronouns, it is troublesome, because now we have to wrangle antecedents. Is it the hatred, or is it the poetry? Of course, hatred seems more likely, but there's just room to wonder. So maybe the hatred surmises the validity of claims around the ill-intended effects of the art form, or in other words, maybe Platonic hatred assumes that claims are based on poetry's ill-intended effects. But the pairing of surmise with the preposition around causes some trouble for me because that's just not a usage I've seen before. I'm not quite sure what it means to assume or guess around something. And we get ill-intended effects of the art form, but what exactly are they? Then we get what I'm reading as ironic self-aggrandizement, a little amusing gesture to go with the Frost quote from earlier, and the claim that poetry goes beyond reason, a recognition that that isn't a new claim, and a recasting of the claim that poetry finds or creates meaning in absurdity. On a basic level, the word choice and sentence structure put the reader through a lot of work to get at relatively simple ideas, and for many readers it might feel like more work than it's worth. This also gestures towards what it's talking about without identifying it explicitly. So, for example, it mentions the ill-intentioned effects of poetry, but I don't think that's something that all readers will know or even agree on. In short, there's more language here than the content really needs, and readers who don't have an appetite for difficult prose may be turned off early on. So what if instead we had something like this? Faith, poetry, and even philosophy have long been held together by the thread of persuasion. While Plato dismissed poetry as ill-intentioned and irrational, poetry doesn't flee or reject reason to indulge in absurdity, but rather creates meaning in absurdity. Now that might not be the exactly correct meaning, but the exactly correct meaning is hard to pin down in the lofty abstractions of the original. There's a lot of plausible deniability in a denser style, or a lot of room for writers to hide when ambiguities and abstractions abound. Putting things more straightforwardly makes it much easier to see what the text has to say, and to see whether it's actually saying what it intends. And the abstract prose style is also reflected in the larger movements of the essay too. When we get to talking about the poetry of Sidney, Raleigh, and Donne, the piece talks about general qualities of their work. For example, about Sidney, we get this. And as Sidney hopes to affirm himself of his identity by reaffirming his love for the same, it betrays the seeker's object of yearning, to put simply, God, and through that seeking and consequent obtaining, one affirms oneself of his existence. And of Raleigh, there is a tint of pretense in Raleigh's poetry. The journey makes him in his mind one of the chosen individuals, a fairly common phenomenon in theological and sadly metaphysical enterprises. The suffering or efforts are in vain in practicality, though in one's mind it makes all the difference. Exclusivity is granted, and all the other unsophisticated people are lowly beings idling their way through life, which not most people, to be honest, though all do. Once upon a time in grad school, I wrote a paper about rhetorical style, and rhetorical theory enthusiast that I was and still am, I spent the whole time talking about general principles of style, theoretical ideas, and what I saw as the implications of it all. Later, when I was talking to my professor about it, he said that when he was reading it, he kept thinking what I wouldn't give for an example. And that was an instructive moment for me. I was still finding my identity as a scholar, and I was caught up in the idea that scholarship was all about ideas, and the loftier, grander, and more abstract my thinking, the better. It wasn't my analysis of a text that was going to set me apart, it was the scale of my theoretical musings. But hearing an experienced scholar say that the real rigor was in the examples and not the concepts changed some things for me. Fundamentally, I think he was right. Words without clear reference are functionally meaningless, and theories without examples are just claims without evidence. So, in this essay's more generalized abstract approach, I see what my professor saw in my own paper. A need for some concrete examples, for the kind of evidence and illustration of these ideas that will A, hold the piece accountable for saying what it really means to say as clearly as possible, B, make the argument much more accessible to readers who could then see where the ideas are coming from, and C, make it all more convincing because the interpretations will clearly and obviously have a grounding in the facts of textual evidence. When I was writing my paper on style, I was lost in my own head, but my professor, who did not have access to my head, was just lost. Making sure that I was sharing not just my ideas, but also the evidence and examples that my ideas were based on, made the whole process much less awkward and arduous for everyone involved. Doing a similar thing here on both the sentence and argument level could then do a lot to clarify the intended meaning and make it more convincing to any reader. And now we'll finish off with a quick trip to the moon, or more specifically, a hotel and casino on the moon in a distant and somewhat grim future. In these first 4 chapters, we find the crew of a little ship docking with the moon base and finding it apparently abandoned. The crew gets in, splits up to do some scouting, and then eventually regroups for dinner in chapter 3. At the end of the chapter, the youngest member of the crew goes missing, and chapter 4 shows us the beginning of the search. Along the way, we catch glimpses of the larger context. There appears to have been a conflict with extraterrestrials. The leader of the crew had been a pilot in that war, and the conflict either ended or at least included some light planetary destruction, glassing in the story's terms. Now, it seems, a lot of things are abandoned, and this crew is wandering from place to place, gathering supplies and surviving. It's been a long time, too, since the youngest in the group has never seen an open space as large as the moon base, and instead grew up entirely on small spacecraft. Also, while they're stopped off at the moon base, they have somewhere else to be for some reason, because one of the crew voices frustration that the captain is letting them all stay at the hotel and casino for too long, when they really should be going where they're supposed to be going. And at a base level, this piece is just fun to read. I had a great time with it. Sometimes people don't take fun very seriously, but I do mean that as a real compliment. I find myself caught up in the quality of the narration and the characters' interactions with each other. For example, we get this moment as the crew is preparing to board the hotel and casino. The rear bay was an industrial place lit with a red light that made the interior frame pieces of the hull look like the ribs in some great gutted animal. The rest of the crew sat in jump seats set between said ribs, tightly strapped to the ship, heads pressed back against their seats, eyes straight forward, jaws clenched. The first mate's voice rang through intercom speakers in the rear bay. Problem with the station, boys. Lids on, just in case. Or this one after they found their way onto the station. They entered a wide dining room with a few tables overturned and a massive crystal chandelier splattered in the middle of the floor. Looking past the mess, the two stopped, dwarfed by the majesty of the tall windows looming up the slanted wall. This spot, this angle, seemed to have been picked out for one precise and magnificent vista. Almost perfectly stationary in the sky, though spinning ever so slowly, was the birthplace of the species. You know, it used to be blue, snorted the captain before moving on. Did you ever visit it? Asked the boy. Visit, said the captain. I was born down there. What was it like? Crowded, he said, and stuffy. So throughout, we get a great sense of place and a compelling sense of these characters, and there are little moments like when one character is flicking through the BIOS and partitioning drives, or another is sweating the mirepoix before setting the sauce to simmer, that I get the sense that we're in the hands of a capable storyteller. These are specific words used in precise ways that work to authenticate the actions. It's not fancy words for the sake of fancy words. It's fancy words that are the right words for the context. And for me at least, I think they're pretty great. But as we look at these 4 chapters as a whole and their relation to the rest of a story that I don't know anything about yet, I do have some questions. So chapter 1 introduces us to the characters, tells us that they're stopping for supplies, and that they need to be back somewhere else soon, and then gets us onto the moon base. Chapter 2 shows us the characters interacting and exploring, which allows us to get to know them a little better, and it hints at the terrible sequence of events that happened long ago, presumably a war with aliens. In chapter 3, we get to cook some dinner and rest a little. We get a sense of tension between the crew. The captain wants to linger and another senior member of the crew thinks they should hurry along, and then the youngest crew member disappears. Then in chapter 4, they go searching for the missing boy. Considering that structure, it looks to me like the disappearance of one of the crew is the first real plot exigence that we have. Yes, they show up in the first place to get supplies, but that doesn't really seem to be a central tension. They know where the supplies are and how to get them. The real trouble, though, begins when the boy goes missing. Now we're going somewhere. So my first question is, why do we wait until chapter 4 for something to really happen? So maybe the easiest fix is just to make these 4 small chapters into one longer one. That way, the first chapter can establish the characters, the setting, and the initial central tension all in one go. As it stands, chapter 2, for example, doesn't seem to be doing much work as a standalone chapter. But it might have some value as pleasant wandering in the middle of a longer first chapter that combines them all, or at least the first 3. I often think of a former teacher's advice to start a story as close to the end as possible, and though he didn't use the term, I think what he meant was that we should get to the central conflict as quickly as possible, because the story hasn't really started until we get to that initial spark. So the question might be, why march a reader through 2 or 3 chapters of wind-up when we could just make it all one chapter? And that might seem like kind of a shallow change, but I think it's useful to think of sections of a text as functional units. And then the question is, what job does each chunk do? As separate chapters, it's just harder to see what important job each chapter has. Chapter 1 sets the scene. Chapter 2 talks about some stuff. Chapter 3 gets the plot moving right at the end, and then Chapter 4 shows us things in motion. But if we combined the first 3, then Chapter 1 would have the job of gathering the kindling and lighting it, and then Chapter 2 would be where we start to see things burn. In that sense, it's clearer to see purpose, or to see why each chapter needs to be its own thing. And I know I keep picking on Chapter 2, but I'm also not going to stop. This is the chapter that gives us some mysterious glimpses of what the world was like in the past. The characters all seem reluctant to talk about it, but at the same time, they all seem defined by it. But as readers, we don't really get to know what's up, and the same thing goes for their motives, for being there in the first place. They know why they're there, but we kind of don't. I think often we get the idea that mystery is inherently valuable, and that withholding information from readers will make for a more dramatic or satisfying reveal later. But in a case like this, we have 2 good examples of both a satisfying mystery that serves the story and a more frustrating mystery that tends to distract from it. Because the mystery about what happened in the war is not a mystery to the characters and not apparently a central focus of the plot, it just kind of feels like readers are being kept in the dark arbitrarily. If everyone else knows what's going on, why can't I? But on the other hand, the mystery of the youngest crew member's disappearance is a mystery to everyone. And it's a primary source of tension for the plot. I feel invested in that mystery, and because nobody else knows what's going on, I feel like I'm in it with them, and not like I'm being kept out of the loop. So on the one hand, I can see the value from a characterization standpoint of seeing these characters only talk about the war obliquely. It tells us something about them that they're unwilling to deal with it all head on. But from a larger storytelling perspective, I don't really see the value of not filling readers in. If the story is not about figuring out what happened all those years ago, why not just tell us? And of course, telling us seems like a normal part of the opening chapter scene setting that we'd expect from a first chapter. In other words, readers generally want to see a clear setup for the story as early as possible. Who's involved? What's at stake? What is motivating everyone? And what direction are we going in? Where we have chapters and sections in the beginning that don't quite do that job, well, then that's where I'm inclined to ask whether we really need them. Some of these moments, as pleasant and enjoyable as they are, feel a little more like time spent than like development of the plot. And that's not to say that we need to maximize efficiency in storytelling. Detours can be rewarding, so long as they're rewarding. And it's just worth knowing that there are readers out there who will always get a little cranky if it's not clear where things are going. And it might not be totally clear where I'm going, so to summarize my recommendations, first, for this piece, or any piece really, it's helpful to think about how you're signaling structure to your reader. 4 small chapters signals that each one has an important job to do, and readers may wonder about the divisions if they don't each have a clear role. Something as simple as collapsing them into a single chapter that clearly serves the purpose of getting the story going makes the experience less ambiguous for readers. It's like a research paper with an introduction and a methods section. Signaling your structure helps readers to know what they're getting and why they're getting it. And while of course fiction doesn't work on the same conventions as science writing, the value of orienting readers is the same, whether it's a lab report novel or one of those poems with triptych in the title. Help readers to see the structure of what you're writing, and they'll spend less time trying to figure out where they are and more time just appreciating it for the good time that it is. And second, think about mystery that serves the plot and mystery that doesn't. In the most general terms, I'd say that things that are only a mystery to the reader can feel alienating, but the things that are a mystery to the reader and the characters are engaging. A mystery for mystery's sake is harder to justify than a mystery that drives the character's actions through the central plot. And that all just brings us back to our dearest friends, rhetoric and audience awareness. Now, I'm not talking about hand-holding or pandering, but I do think that many writers overestimate their readers' tolerance for a lack of information. If you imagine a reader picking up your book after a day of work or a challenging math test or something else, they're probably in the mood for an engaging story more than they are in the mood for a fine-grained interrogation of every word you put down. They might be messaging a friend, stirring a soup, or eavesdropping on a roommate while reading, so your clever, artful, oh-so-subtle implied meanings are going to sail right past them. Clarity and straightforwardness isn't about dumbing it down so much as it is about minimizing the chances that your work will be misunderstood. If the whole thing hinges on someone catching a single subtle detail halfway through, well then be prepared for a lot of readers to miss the point, and don't think you get to enjoy righteous indignation when they do. Because with a little more deliberate signaling and control in your own writing, you could have prevented all those misunderstandings. And to be clear, I'm not saying that this piece is doing anything half so extreme. We're seeing a much milder manifestation of the same kind of principle at play here. So the local concern in this piece is, yeah, maybe just explain the war and what the crew is here to find and why, but the larger principle is this: make it harder for your readers to miss or misunderstand by signaling important information to them clearly, explicitly, and sometimes maybe more than once. For better or worse, no reader except the one writing a dissertation, and I do mean the one writing a dissertation, is going to labor over your work as much as you will. So be generous with context and liberal with explicit structuring, and your readers will be freed to focus on all the good things your work has to offer. As we wrap up, another huge thanks to all our submitters, these 3 especially, and also to all who have sent and continue to send in stuff for us to talk about. I really do think it's fun to talk about your work, and it's a great way to pull broader discussions of writing principles down to the level of practical application. So, in other words, keep them coming. And of course, if you want more detailed and individualized help with your work, head down to the description for more information about working with me one-on-one. At any rate though, it's been fun, as it always is, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching and happy revising.